name is Jay. I'm happy to have you here for the fourth installment of the Rose's digital playwriting course, and today we're going to be talking about genre. Genre is basically how we can categorize our writing, and it's broken down into three parts. That's form, style, and subject matter. Since there are three parts, I think what would probably be useful is breaking down that definition, so let's take a look at each part one by one. Part 1, form. Form is basically the nitty-gritty of the things that make up what you write. Form is basically whether you're writing poetry or you're writing a novel, which is written in prose. Since this is a playwriting class, our form is drama. Now, poetry and prose can make their way into your play script, but that doesn't necessarily mean that it's no longer drama. We're still in drama. Drama genre. Drama genre. Ugh. I hate tongue twisters. Part 2, style. Style is basically how we write. This goes all the way back to the ancient Greeks with a guy named Aristotle, who wrote a book, or collected a book, called his Poetics. In that book, he argued, among other things, that different forms require different kinds of structures. For example, the speech pattern for a comedy is a lot different than the speech pattern for a tragedy, because they're trying to communicate different things. So therefore, the characters need to speak in different ways. Even back in that time, actually, actors could only participate in a comedy or a tragedy. They were kind of lumped into one kind of story that they could tell. Another example might be that the pacing or the plot structure of your piece is different based on the kind of genre that you're writing in. You're telling a different kind of story if it's a lighthearted comedy versus like a war drama. By the way, the 5-act structure that we talked about in a previous video works for most kinds of stories. It's actually the structure that's used in a lot of Shakespeare's plays. Romeo and Juliet and Titus Andronicus are written with the same kind of structure in mind. So make sure you go back to that video to double check the kind of structure you can use. Part 3, subject matter. For lack of a better way to put it, subject matter is basically the content that we write about. More often than not, a story about zombies is a horror story. A story about aliens is science fiction. Subject matter is also where we can start to kind of subvert the idea of genre by altering whether the form or the style or the subject matter. We can change the expectations the audience might have for the kind of story we're telling. A really famous example is actually the Twilight series. The form is a novel. The style is a romantic comedy with some adventure tropes. But the content, the subject matter, is vampires, which we usually see in a horror context. So therefore, that series actually subverts our ideas about genre and the kind of things it's trying to write about. You know, genre is such a weird thing because in many ways, in a practical sense, it's really hard to start with genre as step one when you're trying to write a script. There's a difference between wanting to tell a story because you have a certain character whose story you want to tell, or there's a certain kind of plot that you want to communicate, as opposed to, oh, I want to write a story with these things in it. Something that genre does as well is it introduces us to this concept of the stock character. Stock characters are, for lack of a better word, kind of stereotypes. They are characters that the audience often sees in media, and so they can relate with them more easily because they see a lot of examples of that kind of character. Full disclosure, some of these examples are a little problematic to say the least, but are still worth going over to better understand how they exist in a context. Let's go over 4 common stock characters that you probably see that are really helpful to people while they're trying to write. Number 1, the damsel in distress. This is a young woman who needs to be saved from some kind of evil. This is most of the early Disney princesses. This is Peach from the Mario series. This is Lois Lane from Superman. You know, to be honest with you, the damsel in distress trope is drawn from kind of a sexist notion that women need to be saved. And it doesn't exactly live up to modern expectations of gender roles. This doesn't necessarily mean that any story that has this trope is inherently sexist or bad, but what it does mean is that story in some ways benefits from a sexist idea. This is getting a lot more complicated than I thought it would. Number 2, the mad scientist. The mad scientist is usually a male figure. It's a figure who wants to create or change the world in an enormously dynamic way, usually at the expense of himself or other people. This is Victor Frankenstein. This is Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde. This is Dr. Doofenshmirtz from Phineas and Ferb. Number 3, the village idiot. The village idiot is usually a comic relief character. They usually have like a heart of gold. They want well for everyone. A lot of times, the village idiot will be used to subvert the idea of a hero needing to save the day. Usually as a tool for comedy. This is Don Quixote from the book of the same name. This is Patrick Star from SpongeBob SquarePants. Number 4, the final girl. In a horror narrative, The final girl is basically the young woman who survives until the end of the story. Speaking generally, the final girl tends to be someone who is more educated, is more well put together, has a higher moral standing than the people who might have died in the story. This was a trope that actually started with a 70s movie called The Texas Chainsaw Massacre, but has made its way all the way into R.L. Stein's Goosebumps series. I think in general, something to remember about stock characters or trope characters is that they're useful as tools to communicate to the audience really quickly the kind of story that you're trying to tell. A lot of us, when we start writing, we want to immediately subvert or change all of these tropes because we want to feel different, and we want to feel like we're smarter than these ideas that have existed for a long time. And trust me, I feel that way too, all the time. I think the key, quite honestly, is to be aware that these tropes exist, and not necessarily to lean into them, but to be aware that they exist and that they are tools to be used like any other aspect of your writing. With all of that being said, let's actually move into this week's writing prompt. So last week I presented to you kind of a 6-line scene about taking a friend to a school dance, and what I'd like you to do is to take that script from last week, and I want you to change the genre. How does that 6-line interaction change if the characters are detectives who need to solve a mystery? How does it change if they're people fighting off a zombie apocalypse? By introducing these kinds of differences, we're providing ourselves the opportunity as writers to explore genre in a safe way. Thank you for joining me for the 4th installment of the Rose's digital playwriting class. I'm really excited to continue this project and to connect with you at home. I really hope that you join me next week where we start talking about how we can use our writing to change the world. Side note, when you have the chance, look up how Alex Trebek from Jeopardy says genre. It's really, really funny.